All right, here we go with section 5. Here's your focus question. On October 29th, 1929, a day that soon became known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. A panic ensued, and in 5 hours, $10 billion in market value disappeared. The United States quickly found itself in what became known as the Great Depression, which was the greatest economic calamity in modern history. Signals of impending disaster were visible before October of 1929. Southern California and Florida had experienced spectacular real estate booms and busts, which resulted in failed banks and foreclosed mortgages. The highly unequal distribution of income and persistent depression in farming areas reduced Americans' purchasing power. Sales of new autos and household consumer goods stagnated after 1926, and European demand for American goods also declined. A bursting of the stock market bubble that had been created in the 1920s by speculators was inevitable, but when it happened, it was so severe that it destroyed many investment companies, wiping out thousands of investors and squelching consumer confidence. Around 26,000 businesses failed in 1930, and those that survived cut back on employment and investment. The financial system, which was based on the gold standard, could not effectively meet the downturn. Germany defaulted on its reparations payments to France and Britain, which in turn stopped repaying debts to the United States. Banks failed throughout the world as depositors withdrew money and millions of families lost their life savings. Stocks briefly rebounded but soon resumed their precipitous decline. In 1932, the economy hit rock bottom, with GNP down by a third, prices down by 40%, and more than 11 million workers, about 25% of the labor force, unemployed. Those who had jobs faced reduced wages and hours. Every industrial economy suffered, but the United States was hit hardest. The Depression quickly transformed Americans' lives as hundreds of thousands took to the road to look for work, stood in bread lines, and erected shack cities called Hoovervilles, and cities exhausted their relief funds for the poor. The Depression actually reversed the long-standing migration of Americans from farms to cities as people tried to find land to grow food for their families. The suicide rate rose to its highest level in American history, and the birth rate dropped to its lowest. Also damaged was the public image of big business and Wall Street, which were shown to have thrived on shady dealings, such as the sale of worthless bonds. Many Americans responded to the Depression with resignation or blamed themselves for their economic woes. Others responded with protests that were at first spontaneous and lacking in coordination because the unions, socialist groups, and others that might have led them had been devastated in the 1920s. In early 1932, 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans who marched on Washington to demand the payment of a bonus due in 1945 were dispersed by federal troops. Throughout America, demonstrations by the unemployed demanded work and relief. Farmers protested low prices by temporarily blocking roads to prevent goods from getting to market. The small Communist Party was the only group that seemed able to channel and direct the discontent. Communists formed unemployment councils that organized marches, demonstrated for public assistance, and opposed evictions of unemployed families. The newspapers discussed the idea that America was close to revolution. To many Americans, President Hoover's response to the Depression seemed inadequate and lacking in compassion. His advisors told him that depressions were a normal function of capitalism that removed uncompetitive firms and encouraged moral virtue among the unfortunate. Businessmen vehemently opposed federal assistance to the jobless, and many suggested that individuals would survive the Depression through thrift. Federal policymakers who had never faced an economic crisis of this magnitude did not realize the extent to which consumer spending supported the economy. Most of them did not believe that federal assistance to the unemployed would spur economic recovery. Hoover maintained his commitment to associational action, strongly opposed direct federal economic intervention, and believed that private charity and voluntary action by businesses could keep up investment and employment would suffice. He called together business and labor leaders and established commissions to encourage firms to coordinate maintaining prices and wages without government regulation. Hoover's public reassurances that the economy was recovering clashed with reality. Even pro-business magazines such as Forbes criticized Hoover's response, contributing to the growing sense that the president was ignorant of the problems facing many ordinary Americans. One of the few actions Hoover took to open up jobs drew on the era's heightened nativism. Led by Secretary of Labor William Doak, the Hoover administration curtailed legal immigration while actively deporting undocumented Americans. This especially hurt the Mexican-American community in the Southwest, where raids and scare tactics pushed many to voluntarily depart. Of the more than 400,000 who left, perhaps 200,000 were children who were born in the U.S. and therefore citizens. Some of Hoover's actions, such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised already high taxes on imported goods, caused other nations to retaliate and decreased international trade, and exacerbating the crisis. A tax increase that Hoover won from Congress in order to balance the budget further reduced consumers' purchasing power. By 1932, even Hoover conceded that voluntary measures were insufficient. He signed laws creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loaned money to failing banks, railroads, and other businesses, and the Federal Home Loan Bank System, which gave aid to homeowners threatened with foreclosure. Although he had vetoed bills to create employment with public works projects like road and bridge construction, he now approved $2 billion for such projects and for local relief. But Hoover refused to do anything further, including providing direct aid to the unemployed, which he told Congress would be a disservice to the jobless. In the mid-1920s, some intellectuals had worried that the prevailing notion of freedom in America celebrated unbound economic enterprise, yet accepted limits on free speech and expression and other civil liberties. Though the prosperity of the 1920s reinforced this laissez-faire conception of freedom, the Great Depression and Hoover's failed response discredited it. By 1932, the basis for a new conception of freedom based on progressive-style positive state action in the economy and a respect for civil liberties and cultural pluralism was already present and would become the foundation of modern 20th century liberalism. So that was our fifth section. We'll be back with you with the next chapter.